Telemachus arrives at the home of the swineherd, and the swineherd greets him like a father welcoming home his darling only son. Telemachus meets Odysseus disguised as a beggar, and the three men discuss the problem of the suitors. Telemachus tells the swineherd to tell Queen Penelope he is back in Ithaca, and to have one of her servants tell Laertes the same. After the departure of the swineherd, Odysseus sees Athena outside the house under the guise of a woman, beautiful, tall, and skilled at weaving things. Odysseus goes to meet her, and she says now is the time to reveal himself to his son, Telemachus. She transforms him back into Odysseus the hero, and Telemachus is wonderstruck and believes some god has entered the house of the swineherd. Odysseus tells Telemachus he is his father, and after some disbelief, the father and son embrace and weep together. The two then discuss the slaughter of the suitors and form a plan in which Odysseus, disguised again as a beggar, will go into his own home with the suitors until Athena tells him the time is right. Meanwhile, the suitors are told that Telemachus escaped their ambush and is back in Ithaca. Antinous, one of the suitors, calls for the murder of Telemachus, and Penelope overhears the plot and chastises him. The book ends with the swineherd returning home and feasting with Telemachus and Odysseus, who is once again disguised as a beggar by Athena. Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. Very happy to have you all joining us today. You can check us out on thegreatbookspodcast.com. You can also follow us on X. We're also on YouTube. And you can check out our guide to the Odyssey. We have a question answer guide on our website that can help you or your small group through the Odyssey. Today, we are discussing Book 16, finally a reunion between Odysseus and Telemachus. Today we have a guest. We are sans Adam. We don't know where Adam went, but we don't have an Adam, but we have a Thomas Lackey. We're very happy to have him, our friend, our independent scholar, member of the Sunday Great Books group. Thomas, how are you doing today?
Oh, doing very well.
Good. Well, book 16, how are you, are you a first-time reader? Remind me, are you a first-time reader of the text?
Yes, this is my first time reading either the Iliad or the Odyssey. So first time through Homer.
So I think that, you and Adam sometimes are an interesting contrast, because Adam just goes raw into the text and just reads the text and has those ideas that he brings to group. And then I have this suspicion, this feeling that you read the text and then you reread it, and you might read it again, and then you read about 47 commentaries and bring like this library of wisdom, to our Sunday Great Books group. So
well, that might be too strong a term, but yeah, there's one of these things that it's a text worth chewing on. Let's put it that way, and testing your own ideas against what how other people have read it in the past. Sometimes you're going to read something and you're like, no, I don't. That's just all wrong. I mean, the commentaries sometimes are as a much almost like entering into an argument as it is entering into a conversation. But I think it's valuable either way.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. I'm reading a lot of Neoplatonic literature right now, Catholic Neoplatonic, like the early Greek fathers and things like this. Reading Dionysius and Saint Maximus the Confessor, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, etc. And they have a lot of recourse to the Greeks, actually. And one of the things that's somewhat heartbreaking is they actually talk about all these commentaries. They talk about all these commentaries in the tradition, and even the Neoplatonic Renaissance school, right? In like the 1400s, we'll talk about all these commentaries they have on the Odyssey. And I've actually really started to, I mean, it's too much right now, but I've really thought if we ever come back and visit these texts again, which according to our reading schedule might be in 40 years, I'd really love to actually read some of these commentaries. Another thing that occurs to me that's somewhat heartbreaking is how many of these commentaries are untranslated.
Well, I have one here that's from the sort of from about the year, I think about 1100, a commentary on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it's interesting as well to see the this strongly allegorical turn that it's taking by that point, where downplaying. Well, I say allegorical, but also demythologizing. Athena, instead of appearing, is sort of relegated to this role of, well, and Odysseus had a great idea. It's Athena becomes completely moved into his own wisdom as opposed to an actual goddess. So it's interesting to see just the take. I think I'm just guessing that giving any sort of independent reality to the Greek gods was considered not a good idea.
Yeah, you either kind of go that route, or you just go the good Saint Augustine route, that they're all just demons, right? And that's yes, they did have true reality because they were the demons, right? Yeah, I know, and they often have a lot of an allegorical read on this, which I will admit, as much as I enjoy the allegorical read in Scripture, I don't pick up on it as much reading Homer, and I think some of that is familiarity, right? So the allegorical read is always built on the literal. You have to have a good understanding of the literal, and I think so much of my attention as we kind of move through this year of Homer has been on the literal, insofar as like, what is Homer trying to do? Because the literal is not flat, right? Homer has like a great depth to the literal that helps you understand then what he's trying to teach you. And I've realized that when I read Scripture, my mind immediately jumps to the allegorical. I like that style of reading. I like that depth, that layer of it. But as I read Homer, I'm still very much stuck on the literal, only because I actually think there's a ton of depth here of what Homer's trying to teach us.
Well, and at the moral, which still is below the allegorical meaning, but there's a lot of moral wisdom baked in here. And it's interesting. I think Saint Basil writes about this as well, somewhere about the of Homer as a moral teacher, which again I think sometimes drains away at some point in the tradition.
It's interesting because I feel like that's what a lot of people pick up on when they read the Odyssey, is actually the moral. Like one of the ones that occurs to me, and we also had I'm not going to remember his name, but our foray into the Odyssey had an episode, a topical one, with the individual who runs the magazine The Sword and Spade, which is a good little publication. And he was very much focused on the moral of pulling out this father-son relationship between Odysseus and Telemachus. And I enjoy that. I like that read. I just feel like it's hard for me to pull those threads right now until I really feel like I have a good grasp of what Homer the teacher is trying to actually convey. But I do very much appreciate those. And I do think right now in our culture, when I see the Odyssey talked about in the circles I run with, most of them are, I don't want to say reducing it to, but most of them are presenting it as this very positive story of father and son relationship, a husband coming back to his wife, a king coming back to his kingdom, the importance of place. Like, usually what I see is a very thick moral reading of it.
Well, and on the father-son aspect, I mean, that's a perfect segue to Book 16.
Correct. Yeah, let's get into the text. That is a good segue. So Book 16, we get our reunion. Is it really a reunion between, that's a good question. Is it really a reunion? Because he was a baby when, this has been 20 years. We should keep that in mind, right? Odysseus left. It's basically been 20 years since he's been in Ithaca. Telemachus is a young man. My understanding is that he's basically an infant when Odysseus leaves. I'm not sure there's any actual recognition here. In a lot of ways, Telemachus is, he's meeting a concept, right? He's meeting an abstract.
And I think that goes both ways, right? I mean, I think Odysseus has an image of his son, but he doesn't know his son. And I think that comes out in the text, and I think Homer handles it very, very delicately and very interestingly.
What was interesting to me, just to kind of kick this off, what was interesting to me is that in this book, in which we're going to get a father and son reunion, it starts off with a fatherhood kind of prefigurement in a different character. So if you look at how Telemachus comes, like first, I don't know, this is like line 5 or so, we see that Telemachus, we get the impression that Telemachus often visits the swineherd because the dogs are familiar with him. The dogs don't know who Telemachus is, right? So there's this familiarity that comes in almost immediately. And then line, 20? Homer makes this simile very explicit, right? As a father, brimming with love, welcomes home his darling only son in warm embrace, what a pain he's borne for him and him alone. He contextualizes the relationship between the swineherd and Telemachus in a father and son relationship.
Well, and he carries this through the whole chapter, but our book. But I mean, he really is hammering home on this point too, because it's from some distant land after a 10 years absence, right? He's not letting someone even accidentally escape the juxtaposition. He's like, well, if you didn't catch it the first time I made a connection, well, let me make 3 or 4 or 5 more other allusions so that you can get the point that I'm trying to get across here. And now he does it in such a way that it flows naturally, but it's also an unmistakable idea that that here you have Odysseus. He sees this young man come in. He probably suspects it's his son, but he doesn't actually know. And he sees this reunion, and he's watching, I think, obviously the reunion he would have liked to have had, but there is no actual relationship, just as you were saying. See, the sort of emotional reunion that, especially now that we're 16 books in, we've all been reading this. We want this big moment where finally, after the great search of Telemachus, roving the globe looking for his father, and the father with all his travails getting home, it would, I think, almost be in reality somewhat of an anticlimactic moment to have them just run up and give each other a hug, because again, they don't actually know each other. There is no real relationship, and so we're seeing, in a sense, the sort of reunion they both would have liked to have had played out in front of us in the person of the swineherd, who has acted as a father in Odysseus's absence. I mean, I think this is a strong thing too for Odysseus, because Odysseus is also watching the relationship that he missed.
No, I like that much. I like that very much. I like comparing this relationship between Telemachus and the swineherd as a real one, right? As one that's actually very, it's very present. It's one that's actually been built up over the years, as opposed to Odysseus's, which is actually remains very abstract. And these two are kind of clashing together in a certain way. I also like what that says about the swineherd, because we've kind of been testing him, and his character is like, is he the virtuous character of the Odyssey? In a lot of ways, he's my favorite character in the Odyssey, particularly the first time I read it, mainly because I think I was struggling so much with Odysseus's character, as it was somewhat refreshing to run into someone that I thought was just on its face unilaterally a good man, right? Arete. But keep in mind, like the swineherd is also royalty, right? That's one of the things that we've started to kind of discover about him.
Well, and he's referred to as noble Eumaeus a few times, and there's seems to be a bit of a play with the word noble there. That the first time it's a hint. We don't realize his noble origins yet, and then later we realize that there's more to his nobility. But also,
Yeah,
I would say not less to it, meaning that I think it's both a character and a lineage.
no, I very much agree. I think there's more to the swineherd, I think, that I appreciated than my first reading. When we had on Alec Bianco of the Circe Institute, he kind of set forward a theory too that the swineherd is often called the foreman of men. And there's a literal thing here that's very flat, of just like, well, he's in charge of all the guys on the farm. But then there's, I think, more of an allegorical read, or a thicker read there, that he actually does play a kingly role, right? He actually is playing that noble role with those around him. And even you could push into further, he's a swineherd, and we have seen all of Odysseus's men be turned into swine, right? Is there a relationship between the bestial man and the pig? And that here we have this kind of noble soul, who's really kind of great souled, right? Has a certain magnanimity to him, and he really is a royal character. And it's then fitting that he then plays that father role to Telemachus.
Well, I think there's also an interesting idea here. You have certain characters like Mentor, and even to an extent Laertes, that you would have thought would have stepped into the role, the missing both father and kingly role in Odysseus's absence, and it's not really explained why they haven't filled the role, but they just demonstrably have not done so. The swineherd, on the other hand, has, in a sense, they've fallen short of the role that one would have expected them to have. Here, the swineherd has risen above, where he's taken into this but both with Telemachus, he stepped into the role of father, but also it seems on the estate, he's transcended, as it were, just swineherd to be something of a respected figure, at least among the loyal men. Yeah. In
Yeah, I
contrast, of
agree.
course, he's quite slighted by the disloyal, but that's to be expected.
Correct. Yeah, I like the comparison there with Mentor, right? Because the Mentor was actually asked to be the steward and asked to be the father figure, and he seems to have failed at that, or at least had, or why he failed is, I think, a question, right? Does he lack the capacity to control the elders and the suitors and things like that? And to my knowledge, I don't remember the swineherd being charged with anything, but you're correct. He's organically kind of stepped into this role. The thing that kind of pushed the narrative forward a little bit, one of the things that really stood out to me too was with Fagles, I think it's just before line 50, is there's like a certain level of humility and modesty that kicks in with Telemachus, which is not entirely a virtue that we always associate with the Greeks. But if I read this correctly, Telemachus comes, he has his reunion with the swineherd, if you will, and then he realizes, like, oh, there's a beggar in the house, and the beggar which is Odysseus, his father, is sitting in a chair. And Odysseus then starts to defer to Telemachus to give him the chair, which would have been correct in the hierarchy. And Telemachus says no. Like, I'll just find another chair, right? This is down right before line 50. He says, as he approached his father, Odysseus rose to yield his seat. But the son, on his part, waved him back. Stay where you are, stranger. I know where we can find another seat somewhere, here on the farm. Here's the man to fetch it. I mean, this might not seem a lot to us because it's a young man deferring to an elder, etc. But I actually find this really unique in the Greek context because we don't see a lot of humility. And actually, the only other time I can think of it is also with Telemachus when he was, I can't remember. He's either visiting Nestor. No, he must be visiting Menelaus because it's Nestor's son who praises Telemachus for his modesty in front of Menelaus. So it's just an interesting note here that he plays this kind of modest, humble role.
Yeah, and he says, "Sit down, stranger." So he refrains from asking him his name until after they've eaten. In fact, even then, he doesn't ask him directly. He asks the swineherd, "What's the story of the stranger?" There's again this idea that you don't simply interrogate and challenge a guest, but that you welcome them, you feed them, you make sure that they have all that they need, and then invite them to tell their story if they're ready. And he starts this even here. Um, he doesn't do what someone might reasonably think he might do, which is, oh, hey, who are you? What are you doing here? Instead, he's like, no, sit down. I'll find my own seat. Or actually, in this case, I'll let the swineherd find the seat. But still, it's a graciousness that he shows, and I think there's a to the extent that so much of the Odyssey does have to do with this idea of how a guest should be treated, and the moderation that I mean, we had I think it was just in the previous chapter when Telemachus is leaving. We have this great line about to welcome a guest in his coming and hasten him in his departing. That you're helping in either direction, and I think there's something of that gracious and moderate behavior that's being shown through Telemachus here.
I agree. I think I like the tethering that to the guest friendship, just another kind of reflection of how beautiful I think that practice is and how much it can actually critique us as Catholics, right, who actually have the benefit of grace in the example of our Lord Jesus Christ. And here are the pagans having this like very open, vulnerable practice, right, of guest friendship. What did you make? I mean, any thoughts here? We see Telemachus and Odysseus start to interact. So this is around line 100. And, it's Odysseus. There's always going to be tests. There's always going to be, kind of these multiple layers to his conversation. The one I thought was interesting here is, he's basically asking Odysseus is basically asking him, what's going on in the home, which again, part of this overall motif of Odysseus the beggar, we should remember is that he's going to be testing things. He's going to be finding things out. The narrative that's haunting in the back of all this is the narrative of Agamemnon, who comes home in triumph and all these things and ends up being killed. At least in the Oresteia, he's killed in the bath, right, by his wife and his wife's lover. And so we're always thinking that in the back of mind, and that this is why Odysseus has to come in this kind of clandestine, secretive way. I somewhat found this to be a critique of Telemachus, or at least maybe not a critique, but he's pushing Telemachus to see what's going on. Because he kind of says this line around 111, right? Well, would I were as young as you to match my spirit now, or if I was the son of the great Odysseus, for the king himself. And then he's like, if I let some foreigner, I'd lop off his head, blah, 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 blah. So he's kind of pushing and critiquing into Telemachus a bit here, and which Telemachus handles with grace and tells his story. But this is just the same Odysseus, right? He's just going to test and test and test.
Yeah, I do want to rewind just very slightly right before this narrative, because I'm curious to see what your translation says. But when Telemachus, after they've done eating, and he turns to the swineherd, in my translation here, which is by Peter Green, he says, "Dad, where did this stranger come from? How did the sailors bring him to Ithaca?" And this is I just want to highlight that as a deeply ironic line, because he's addressing the swineherd as dad, asking who this stranger is. And I mean, again, we had this father-son dynamic going on between them there, but I don't know if it's ever more explicit than here, or ever put in such a contrast to the fact that the stranger, of course, really is his father.
Yeah, I wonder what the Greek is underneath that, because in Fagel's line, this is line 65 or so, Telemachus asks his loyal serving man at last, "Old friend, where does this stranger come from? Why did the sailors land him here in Ithaca?" So it's actually old friend. So I wonder what the term there is in the Greek. It probably has a deep level of familiarity to it that can then go either way.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's curious. I mean, my guess is, unfortunately, there's not a footnote on this translation, at least not right there, as to why he chose that. So it, I would assume it has at least some justification in the text, which
Yeah,
is an
because that
interesting.
calling him dad is just really heavy, right? I mean,
Well,
that's
and at least in this translation, the dad is used a few times. And I think there was one. I'm looking now at the commentary for Fitzgerald. I think there was one where she's used something like "ata" or something like that in the Greek, which is something to, again, a familial term, something like uncle, or to that extent.
You're fine. Maybe we'll flag that and
Yeah,
bring it up to
yeah, maybe.
Dr. Malky at some point. Because yeah,
Yeah,
dad there has a completely different connotation than just old friend, right? It plays out
yeah.
that theme of father and son.
But yeah, so yes, so skipping ahead, I mean, just a few lines here. I mean, I think Telemachus is already a bit conflicted, because he's having this conversation with the swineherd. It's a little difficult to imagine the setting, because it's in a small room, presumably. I don't think the swineherd's hut is, a vast hall. Yet he's talking to the swineherd at first, almost as if Odysseus were out of hearing. Who is this? What's going? And he's answering it, but obviously we know, of course, Odysseus does overhear them. But he's just describing his distress slightly before. It's like, I can't even send him home. I would greet him properly, but I can't, because the suitors, they might mock him. It would be a great shame to. I can't even. I mean, I think there's an embarrassment that's crept in. He's realizing, look, I can't even greet my guest properly, because I'm not the master of my own house. Not even to the extent of trying to get this, man a warm bed and a good meal. I can do that here in the swineherd's hut, but I can't do that at my own home. And
Yeah, a little bit before line 100 in Fagles, it's hard for a man to win his way against the mob. And before that, he says, they would make a mockery of him, and then that would break my heart. So again, I think that Homer, what's really shocking about Telemachus to me is how much he's presented as a young man of arete, right? This young man of excellence, who has then also suffered fatherlessness. So he leaves, right? So we have to, because what Telemachus can be kind of forgotten about, because now that we have Odysseus back on Ithaca, like his story kind of becomes primary for good reason. But Telemachus's own like maturation arc, right, and his own coming of age story, I think is really unique. But one of the things that strikes me is Telemachus, because I find him to be a very affable character, is that he is like strangely virtuous for a man who grew up in such a disordered home. That he has no father. He has a mother who, in a lot of ways, is a recluse, trying to figure out what to do with all these suitors. And then you have all the suitors in the house who we find out, I can't recall exactly where, but it's very explicit at one point that like they were very abusive to him as he grew up as a young man. And then not over them, also the serving women were abusive to him, right? The serving women particularly that have, coupled up with the suitors. So he just strikes me here um, as incredibly humble, which again I think is odd just for a Greek context in general, right? Where we talk about arete and your thumos and seeking glory and kleos and etc. That he's deferential to the beggar. He has a strong sense of guest friendship. You can say, well, of course he does, because guest friendship's been violated his whole life. But that's not typically what you see. A kid that grows up in a disordered household doesn't immediately understand the value of an ordered household. But he's just this kind of shining light. In certain ways, I'm much more. I have a greater affinity towards him than I do Odysseus.
Well, he has a certain nobility of character. I think there's no doubt to that. And I think the question that his father is then starts to needle about, he's trying to feel out what sort of man his son is. I mean, this is again the first time he's ever seen him, and he's trying to, I think, to decide. And through these tests, as we keep talking about, Odysseus tests everyone. He's trying to test whether or not is this reticence one of prudence or of weakness. And I think there's I mean, tell me, do you, so here he says, so obviously Odysseus has been overhearing this conversation, and it's at this point that he interrupts and says, I'm skipping down slightly from his first lines, but do you let yourself be oppressed, or is it that some god's word has led your countrymen to hate you? And again, this is so what is it that why aren't you writing this situation? I also say, he says, or is it your brothers that are to blame? This could be him masking his knowledge of the situation, although momentarily he's going to actually reveal an intimate knowledge of the situation. So I think actually it's possibly, is it your brother's blame? He's actually feeling out whether or not there are any brothers, right? I mean, I think he's, he has a suspicious mind. We'll put it that way. And he's heard all good reports, but I think he wonders, well, has Penelope been faithful? And this is yet one more test.
Yeah,
in a
I like that.
roundabout way.
No, I like that a lot. I mean, just mainly because it just seems to be so fitting to his own character.
And I also think that he's starting to feel, obviously the time is almost at hand. And I think it's and I think he also, I can imagine, and again, I think Homer is really conveying this so well. I think more than anything also right now, Odysseus wants to be discovered. Right? I think he wants his son to recognize him without him having to drop the mask. And so he keeps going right up to the line here. If I were Odysseus's great son, or even the man himself, I mean, he couldn't be hinting more strongly. And he said, when I come to the main hall of Laertes' son, I'd much rather go down fighting, killed in my own home. Again, my own home. Obviously, you could say, well, he's just, he's imagining that. I mean, from Telemachus' perspective, you can imagine, well, he's saying that he'd much. Or, I mean, the question is how literally. I guess what I'm guessing is that Odysseus keeps walking right up to the line of actually just declaring who he is, and then making it just slightly ambiguous enough to still leave an opening. And I think it's reckless, but I think he wants to be seen, but knows he's not. He's been forbidden from revealing himself.
Well, one thing we're going to see, I think, in the text, and I think there's an argument there about what the swineherd understands and knows, is that those who are familiar with Odysseus, and particularly those, I think, who have an affinity for him, seem to be able to perceive him through his disguise, even though the disguise is divine, right? It's not like he went out and rolled himself in the dirt, right? This is something Athena has done to him. But still, the disguise seems to become thin when people who love him perceive him. The problem, though, is that Telemachus has no imagery from which to pull from, right? So everyone else is like, oh, you remind me of the king, right? You're built like the king. And we'll kind of see this. This becomes almost absurd to a certain degree when Odysseus gets to his own home, right? Because they're going to be like, man, that beggar really looks really buff and like a warrior, right? Like clearly, like, guys, something's happening here. Like, click in here. And so I think that one of the things that we need to flag as we kind of finish out the text is who has a suspicion that this is Odysseus. And I think a lot of people who love him start to have that suspicion. And a huge conversation we'll have is, what does Penelope know? Because clearly, if someone's going to recognize him, the intimacy between husband and wife should recognize him. But poor Telemachus he has no memory. He has nothing to pull from.
Yeah, and Odysseus here has nothing either, right? I mean, he has no scar to point to, no story to tell. Oh, do you remember when we did such and such? There's nothing here. I think he does, after Athena gives him, we'll get to this, I think he does do something, but let's keep marching forward with the text. I also, by the way, he talks about his mother in this. He basically describes all his problems here with the suitors and how he is the only son. He's the only son of an only son of an only son. And he it's an interesting way he puts this, because he said that it's been Zeus's will. I think that is both true and interesting in the context later of the fact that, basically Odysseus is going to refer to Zeus and Athena as their helpers. Because in a sense, Telemachus is also saying, Zeus has left me alone. So I think Telemachus has a somewhat more complicated, if you will, relationship with the gods than Odysseus does. Odysseus converses with them. Now, it's true that Athena has appeared to Telemachus, and to such a greater extent than in most people, that we start to wonder. But in the last book, for example, when he's warned to come to come back home, it's done so in a dream-like way, so that he's basically spurred in through his own natural hate, concerns about his situation. I want to just kind of contrast the difference. It's not as if he's simply standing there holding a conversation with Athena face to face. Now, that happened earlier, but now there seems to be this kind of he has had a visitation, if you will, but it's a much more easy one to forget and to dismiss, if you will. I mean, it doesn't have to be fair, though, within our own religious tradition, this sort of still small voice is a more is the more common religious experience than the the dramatic visitation. And so, I mean, I think there's a thing here where he has this like I said, he kind of believes and he sort of doubts at the same time, if you will. Or at least he doubts the willingness of the gods to help.
I agree. I think one thing that we've been tracking even since we read the Iliad was who has the capacity to recognize the gods. And sometimes it's a divine gift, like with Diomedes, it was like a very explicit gift, like, I'm going to give you this to you. But then a lot of times, I think they run parallel with what you said. A lot of times it just seems to be built out of habit. Like, so when Athena goes to Odysseus for the very first time in the Iliad, if I remember correctly, this is when, remember, Agamemnon decides to test them in and says, we all need to go home. And they all start running back to the ships. And Odysseus grabs the scepter to try and turn them around. What's Athena that comes to him? And the first thing it says is that he immediately recognized the goddess's voice. So Odysseus has this habit, right? He's been habituated to hearing her, where Telemachus has not. And I think we'll see this where he somewhat struggles to see the work of the divine, or he knows it's happening, but he can't quite figure out how or why. Where insofar his father very much has a more mature vision simply from experience.
Well, and it's explicit later in this book. I mean, we have a scene which we'll get to in which there's Telemachus and Odysseus and Athena, and Telemachus does not see or recognize her, and Odysseus does. I mean, it's there's only 3 people there, and yeah.
Well, let's push forward a little bit here, because this brings up one of the characters that I've always kind of struggled to really appreciate or really kind of just wrap my mind around, and that's Laertes, King Laertes. I think I've mentioned before, the first time I read the Odyssey, I was shocked when I realized that he was alive, that he's still on Ithaca. Mainly because I just figured, like, if the patriarch of the home is still alive, that he'd be right there in the thick of things with Penelope or trying to make things better or etc. And I think we get a little bit of an insight here. This is around 160 in Fagles, where Telemachus is, telling the swineherd about he needs to go tell his mom, Penelope, that he is home, that he's arrived safe, right? If the swineherd could run and go play this messenger role. And they ask about, well, what about King Laertes? And we kind of find out, well, he's actually out on this country estate out in the farm. And Telemachus' response, I think, is really interesting, where he says, so much the worse. Telemachus answered firmly, leave him alone. Though it hurts us now, we must, if men could have all they want, free from the taking. I'd take first my father's journey home. Laertes has become this character who is literally just like swallowed in grief, right? He's literally just out there in a country estate, almost just like a broken man. And we kind of saw that something had happened, I think, because if you remember when Odysseus went down to Hades, he finds his mom. And Odysseus doesn't know his mom's dead when he does that. And it's really ambiguous about what happened to his mother. I actually think when we did the podcast on that, I actually just read it as a suicide. I just read it flat on its face because it has this line where she died from her grief. And I've gone back and looked that the tradition is somewhat split on whether that means she killed herself or whether she just, succumbed to some type of illness or something because of the grief. But I think Laertes then just is broken. Like his thumos, right, his spirit is literally just broken, and he's out on this country estate, basically tending to the plants and doing whatever while pining for his son to come home, and Ithaca's in this broken political stance.
And now it says that Telemachus is left. He's even ceased eating, and just descent lower and lower into this depression and grief. I do find him a very interesting. It seems like we're missing one part of the story, and it goes back even further than that, because why was Odysseus king? I mean, it's not clear to me why, when his father was still fairly young and hale and hearty, that Odysseus was king in his place.
Yeah, that's a good question. I also think too, and this is very speculative, one of the things about King Laertes here that it says, though, is that he would take his meals with the hired hands whenever he felt the urge to. And it's a little bit broad there about whether or not what's happening there is it's a statement of like his grief, like he's just kind of fallen down, into the king has fallen all the way down into this like peasantry and has just, completely fallen into depression, or whether that's a statement of his character that, he associates with the workers and he has a certain level of humility to him. I typically wouldn't read it as the latter, but I was wondering in my head whether or not to tether this to Telemachus, whether Laertes has had any say or voice or impact on Telemachus as a young man growing up, and whether or not, that type of humility or modesty of like, this high king coming down and eating with the peasantry, if that's where Telemachus pulls his kind of natural bent towards being modest. Because again, it's such a weird trait to read amongst the Greeks.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that at all. I mean, I think it is interesting. I mean, I think the natural reading is, in many of these sorts of cases, Greeks and Egyptians and others, that you see a complaint about an inversion of the order of things as a sign of calamity, right? So that the king would be eating with servants would be taken flatly to mean that the world is turned upside down, right? So, but I think in this case, it's not quite as clear, because it seems to be a worse thing that he's no longer eating at all. It seemed to be a good thing that he would at least come out and eat with, and like you said, the commerce here that Telemachus and the swineherd have, the relationship that they have, is obviously very close, and to both of their credit, right? It's not meant as a bad thing in any way, and so I think that makes it a difficult read, because I think it could go either way. I mean, maybe that's another aspect of Homer's genius. That maybe it means maybe he's woven in the sort of double poetic meaning here.
I think too, as I kind of sit here and think about it, it occurs to me that probably the best source, or the one that's most explicit, if we had to make an argument of where has Telemachus learned virtue, then I think you have to tether that to the swineherd and the familiarity, right? Because the swineherd's an incredibly virtuous character. That Arete, and maybe I shouldn't use that term virtuous, because what does that mean in this context, right? But he seems incredibly loyal. He plays his station well. I think loyalty, particularly for those under the king, is like the number one virtue that they can have, and that's what basically the whole house is going to be judged on. So if I had to tether Telemachus's seeming modesty and arete to someone, it seems like the explicit one is the swineherd. But I'm also somewhat curious if King Laertes played any role there.
We also see that if we rewind to the 14 and 15 chapters, I think it's 14, 15, we see the swineherd as pious and generous as well, right? Mm-hmm. Because he's excellent sacrifices to the gods, gives the best pieces to his beggar, stranger guest, and so I think we see a lot of good. It becomes an interesting question, which will come up again momentarily. Why doesn't Odysseus let the swineherd in on the secret yet? I mean, he does eventually, but why not yet? And I think that's an interesting sort of question mark to hold out there.
No, I agree. Do you want to take us into Athena showing up in Athena's role?
Yeah. So with that they sent off the swineherd. It said, nor did Athena fail to see that the swineherd departed, and herself approached now in the likeness of a woman, one tall and handsome, and skilled in fine handiwork. She stood outside the hut's entrance, visible to Odysseus, but Telemachus neither saw her in front of him nor was aware of her presence. Gods are not clearly manifest to all. So that brings in what we were talking about earlier. And I think you said in weaving, that translation works a little bit better in noticing that this is, a connection to the weaving out of these plans. So that the idea of weaving has in that multi-layered meaning, that she's cunning not just in handiwork, but in stratagems and schemes and plans, and the working out of all these things. But right. I think for once she appears as herself. She's not mentor here. She's not, she is as close to herself as a human being can perceive her to be. But
yeah, and I would agree with that in a certain aspect of her, right? Because she is the goddess of certain crafts and things like that. Because I took this as she's basically appearing in a certain way as the woman par excellence, right? She's beautiful, but she's also skilled at these things. If you remember, like in the Iliad, when Agamemnon is saying all his wonderful things about his slave girls, right? That's the two things they're praised on, right? One, they're beautiful, and two, like they're going to bring a lot of beautiful things into your home because they have these skill sets. And so here she kind of takes on, because this is an interesting disguise for her, right? I took it as a disguise that she looks like a normal woman, but it's an interesting disguise for her. Right?
It says in the likeness of a woman. So, I mean, it does seem that she has a human appearance. Now, obviously, the gods are anthropomorphic, but there's something about them that's divine in their appearance as well. And in here, it says in the likeness of a woman, which implies. But there is a kind of idea here of whether it's lady philosophy for Boethius or lady wisdom in Suso or in Proverbs. There's this personification of, and in many of those cases, there's also the if you think about Proverbs, say 31, you have this association between craft and womanly virtue and wisdom as well.
Well, because you can't just go buy things on Amazon, right? I mean, if you're creating baskets and stuff around your house, like if you're going to have good things in your home, then the women as like the caretaker of the home, sometimes we still don't understand like what a role that is for the moderns, right? Because we just think of like, oh, you have to care for the children and do whatever. No, I mean, they're tending the hearth, they're building things, they're doing all these things that bring a lot of riches to the home that's completely isolated and separate from like the masculine role. of going outside the house and trying to bring things in. Right? There's certain things you can do there. So no, I think that's a good parallel between both the Hebrew and the Greek side on this. Did you
Well,
read this though as like Telemachus literally still does not see her? Like even in her disguise, he seriously still can't even see her.
Can't even see her. So in this one, it says neither saw her in front of him nor was aware of her presence.
Yeah, this
Right.
says he can't even sense her there. But what's hilarious is that obviously Odysseus sees her, but the dogs do.
The animals have an amazing sense of perception in Homer, which I find this really fascinating because the dogs sense the gods, but also, of course, and we'll see presently, the dog can penetrate Odysseus's disguise in a way that no one else can do. Everyone else starts, even when they penetrate, there's a kind of suspicion, like, is this really Odysseus? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The dog just straight up recognizes him.
Right. Yeah, I just think that's funny that Telemachus gets outdone by the dogs on as far as their capacity to, see the divine. And also why Odysseus or why Athena bothers with the disguise if there's no one else there and Telemachus can't see her anyway.
Yeah, and I'm going to assume if Telemachus can't see her, let's just assume that there are no really passerbys, but let's just say there was a passerby that they couldn't see her either. So she's there. I think she's there to remind Odysseus that she's there, because Telemachus and Odysseus are going to have a discussion. They haven't already had it, is it? About what help
Which
they
one?
have. No, okay, it's going to be presently. It's just ahead. And I think we come back to this question of Odysseus has arrived at a confidence in the help of the gods that Telemachus doesn't have, and I think that Athena here is ahead of time, but she's reinforcing that confidence ahead of when it's about to be needed most.
Well, what's interesting, just to push the narrative ahead a little bit, Telemachus' incapacity to see the gods, now that we discuss this, is somewhat comical because then he confuses Odysseus for a god, right? So now he thinks he's seen one, right? He actually sees one, but it's actually just his father. That's at line 210 or so. Telemachus says, basically said that you must be a god. And he says, no, I'm not a god. The long-enduring great Odysseus returned. Why confuse me with one who never dies? No, I am your father, the Odysseus you wept for all your days. I love that line, right? Like, I'm the one that you've been weeping for. It's a hell of a line. You bore a world of pain, the cruel abuse of men.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's also, depending on how you read that, it seems a little self-serving in one way for Odysseus. The other possibility is that he's looking at it and saying, look, you've suffered because of me, right? You've suffered for my sake. And I think it's a gentler read, but I think it would be something that's very realistic as well, is that Odysseus has realized that the hardships you've gone through, I wasn't here to help you, but to some extent I am to blame for that. Maybe not all to blame, maybe not wholly to blame, but somewhat to blame, and you've suffered on my account.
I just had a random association in my head with this relationship in the Johnny Cash song about a boy named Sue, where the dad abandons him and names him Sue so he'll grow up strong and tough. Anyway, that's the Oklahoma coming out in me. One thing I would point out here, probably on a slightly more mature level, is like I mentioned earlier, I haven't been great about thinking about the moral read and extracting the moral lessons. But here, I thought it was really interesting where Odysseus says, I am your father. And Telemachus basically pushes back a bit. And I don't think he's being testing like Odysseus would be, but rather Telemachus has no guidepost. He has no memory of his father. And it really occurred to me the spiritual principle, which I think is really just a human one, that knowledge is an antecedent of love, right? That you have to know something before you can love it, right? Because typically in the church, right, we talk about that God created us to know, love, and serve. And they actually happen in that order, right? You have to know something before you can love it. And then once you love it, that you'll serve it. And so here I think is this kind of a very natural showing of this, is that Odysseus has this, I am your father. And before we can get the line of like them weeping uncontrollably, Telemachus has to kind of have that knowledge. He has to push into the knowledge before the love can actually come.
Well, and I think that's why if we had a lesser writer would have just had them somehow recognize each other right away and run up and give each other a big hug and say, "Oh, it's so good to see you." By having that reunion with the swineherd, we have the reunion we're talking about of someone that you can actually know and love. And now we're seeing this stressed here of a relationship that they've both wanted but never in fact had. And so I think when you hear when you get this when they do when the tears come as well, I think they're weeping for that. There's 20 years of pent up weeping that all of a sudden comes out. It's not just tears of joy, it's tears for all that they've suffered and held back from weeping on before. And it's finally, I mean, we even were told that Odysseus has held his tears back. I think that's true as regards as regards this particular conversation where he wasn't going to. We actually skipped the line where Athena said, "Go ahead and tell him," but he wasn't going to reveal anything until Athena gave him the permission. Now it's here, and it is somewhat ironic that he's not believed. But it's also ironic because Telemachus, we're just talking about Telemachus doubting the intervention of the gods. He makes a not unreasonable assumption. Well, maybe you are a god. And he's like, no, I'm not. But the gods are helping me. Athena has been helping me right now, and she can to make me look young or old as she wills. That's going to be important in a moment because then Telemachus just asks, well, so who's going to help us? Well, if anyone had just had a miraculous sign that they had divine favor, they just had it. But I think there's another thing here. So okay, they're weeping. He says, well, actually, they're not weeping. Let me show you that. He says, you're not my dad. You're God. He's like, no, I'm not. But then he says, Telemachus, it's not fitting when your own father is here in the house to be so astonished and indeed suspicious. I tell you, no other Odysseus will ever come here. So I think there's a thing here that's kind of interesting. One, Odysseus telling anyone else not to be suspicious is very funny. It just
Right.
is. Chip off the old block here. And it does him some credit. I actually think what Odysseus is doing here is more subtle than that. He, like a father, is correcting his son. And I think that's the moment at which Telemachus kind of it breaks through to him that his dad is here, is saying, hey, don't put your elbows on the table. It's just it's a gentle correction. It's a small correction, but he is immediately and for the first time, essentially, stepping into his fatherly role, saying, "No, actually, this is not how a son should respond to his father." And I think that it's that stepping into the fatherly role that somehow lets Telemachus see who he really is.
I like that. It also occurs to me the parallels here that we're going to see with Penelope. So Telemachus's concern, right, is that you're just some spirit spellbinding me now to make me ache with sorrow all the more. It's interesting because we're going to see Penelope basically pick up that exact same concern. That like, oh wait, no, like remember, like, oh no, you might be a god who's come to trick me, which then means. Oh, go ahead.
And we know that happens, right? We have. It's not an abstract concern for Penelope because not only has she been, she's resisted all the suitors and all the rest, but she knows from her own Greek stories that the gods sometimes appear as husbands. I can't remember who off the top of my head. Was it Poseidon? Or was it Zeus that appeared as someone's husband? But it was mentioned. Well, it was one of the people in Book 11, though. Was one of the children of this. So Penelope, I would say, by the way, is suspicious. Well, of the god of a god appearing to seduce her, just like a suitor might try to seduce her.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really practical concern in Greek mythology, right? I mean, Zeus shows up with all kinds of things, so it's reasonable. It just occurs to me that's interesting that that Telemachus and Penelope share the same thing. I think that also one thing we need to note as Odysseus starts to reveal himself is what does it take for someone to believe him? And what's interesting here is Telemachus is the first one, and I think what we're going to see as the text plays on, that it's a pretty low bar. Telemachus basically just believes him after, so I like what you say, that is he stepping into a fatherly role. I think that's something certainly to think about. But basically, Odysseus just pushes back once, and Telemachus believes him. And I think that's something to take note of, because then as Odysseus reveals himself to more and more people, what is your level of epistemology, right? What's your standard of actually believing him is going to change and vary depending on which person it is.
Yeah, and I agree. I think Telemachus by far is the lowest bar. I mean, and you see that some people take are lean more towards physical signs, and then others towards aspects of character and all the rest. I mean, without giving away too much for the Penelope case, I think Penelope is interesting because she, like Telemachus, is the only person as well trying to discern. Not only is this the man is this a man or not, is also a question for Penelope in a way that it isn't for other. Is this really Odysseus? But this is like, well, is this a god just pretending to be Odysseus? Because then that god would have knowledge that even a person. So I think when Penelope tests, she's also testing his attitude, which even a god isn't the same. Even a god might have the same knowledge, but not the same character.
Correct. So let's let's sally forth a little bit and push into Odysseus telling him his story, right? Telemachus says, how did you get here? How did you actually arrive here? Because again, I think a natural question is, where are all your men? Where is everybody, right? Like where's your spoils from Troy? Where's your fleet? I mean, there's a lot of ships that went off with him.
Well, and also, I mean, like, I was just looking for you, and where'd you come from, right? There's a kind of a yeah. And so he begins, and he's I'll say here again, he says, I've come here at Athena's instigation so that we may make plans to kill our enemies. So his constant invocation of the gods here, I think, becomes important.
No, it does, because actually that's the main pivot, isn't it, on Telemachus's response? So in Fagles it says, and Athena's inspiration spurred me here now, so we could plan the slaughter of our foes. And I drew a line down the page to Telemachus's response, where he says, all my life I've heard of your great fame, a brave man in war and deep in mind and counsel. But what you say dumbfounds me, staggers the imagination. And basically his thesis is, Dad, there's like 100 of these suitors. How are we going to slaughter them? I think for Telemachus, I mean, it's interesting to play this out. He can't see the gods. He can't see Athena, and he completely even misses Odysseus's statement that Athena is the one that's going to help us. It seems to just go completely over his head.
Well, and of course he knows that Athena led him on his own journey, and now Athena has led him back. And now his father is here saying, and Athena led me here too. In fact, Athena brought us both together right here so that we could plan our attack. And he's like, Dad, we can't plan an attack. That's madness.
He's just very unfamiliar with the gods. It's really interesting. He has no intimacy with them. He's very unfamiliar. I mean, you think about the fact that he spent all that time with Athena disguised as mentor. And remember, there was that like really funny line where Athena's literally sitting next to him in Nestor's home. And Nestor talks about how much Athena helped his father, Odysseus. And Telemachus is like, well, she would never help me. Like, she's never going to come down and do anything for me like that. And she's sitting right next to him, right? Until she literally has to, like, what was it? She transformed into like a bird or an eagle and like flew away before they actually figure out what's going on. So he just doesn't. I mean, it's interesting, I think, to tie this in to his coming of age, that he's not just becoming a man, but also part of his maturation and step into maturity is his capacity to see the gods.
Well, and I think the contrast is really interesting just right at this exact moment, because he lists basically this litany of reasons why it will never work. And his father said, well, I tell you, we have two helpers, and decide for yourself if they're enough, Athena and Zeus the father, or should I find some other defender? And
right.
Telemachus' reply is so interesting, because he says, good indeed are these two defenders you mentioned, sitting high up there in the clouds. Now, I mean, the sentence goes on, but I mean, oh yeah, it's great, but they're a long way off, right? And they don't really
Did you take this though as because I took it as a tit for tat on sarcasm, right? Because Odysseus's response, I think, is sarcastic, right? oh, well, listen to me closely. Think, will Athena, flanked by Father Zeus, do for the two of us? Like, there's no way that's not loaded with sarcasm. But so I think what we're seeing here is Telemachus has his own wit because it's like, oh, yeah, those are two great champions off in Mount Olympus, off in the clouds, right? We're down here. So, I mean, I think Telemachus is the son of Odysseus and Penelope, right? We should expect that wit and cunning to be with him.
No, and I think it is good banter back and forth between them, but I think as it were, the irony of Odysseus's statement is that it's not ironic, right? Because
Mhm.
Athena was literally right there moments before. She's the one who just changed his appearance. That again, moments before, and so the idea that they're off in the far heavens is it's one of these things that would normally be true, except that it isn't, and which makes the whole thing sort of funny.
Well, let's look at the next section here, line 300, and this is the plan, right? So we finally kind of get what's the plan? How are we actually going to take the palace back? How's Odysseus going to be the king back on his throne? And I mean, just to summarize very briefly, basically Odysseus is going to infiltrate his own home as a beggar, right? That's what he's going to do. And he's basically going to do reconnaissance. He's going to sit here, he's going to watch, he's going to understand the suitors, and there's going to be a giant test of loyalty. I think that's a main theme of Odysseus going in, that when he's a beggar, he can start testing everyone's loyalty, all these kind of different groups that are inside the home, to see who is loyal to him. And kind of picking up the theme that you've pointed out, is that then what's the catalyst? Like when does he know that he's ready to take his home back? It's when Athena says so. I mean, this thing is highly predicated upon the gods, right? Very much Athena backed by Zeus, of when you can actually take your home back.
Yeah, when Athena puts it in my mind, I'll nod to you. So there's two ways to read this. I read this within the text as literally Athena. Obviously, some of the medieval Greek commentators are going to say that he's referring to just prudence and wisdom in the abstract. I think there's something else here that's interesting, which is that he basically counsels his son, look, I know they're going to mistreat me. You're going to have to hold back, and just let it happen. There's an idea of humility here as well, and of restraint and moderation that is, I think, really interesting. Also, I think there's a thing that's going to come up again momentarily, but he said you can tell them to give over their mindless folly using gentle words, but they won't take any notice. Their fatal day is at hand. And I think there is a sense here where the die has been cast, right? They could have turned back in various ways. Different things could have happened. We'll talk about this with the council the suitors have in a little bit. But I think there is an idea here now that the judgment is accelerating.
I think I agree with you, because I think one thing to watch as we move into the back half, of this text and kind of wrap up this narrative, is I think a question that occurs to me as I've read it is, to what capacity do the suitors have any chance of actually repentance? So when you talk about the die is cast, right? The fate has done this. Like, is there any movement here? Can any of the suitors be like, oh, never mind, I realize this is wrong, or hey, that beggar kind of looks like Odysseus, I should probably get out of this house, right? I think this is a question to watch as we kind of move through the text, is, do any of these guys actually have the capacity to have some type of repentance, right? Some type of metanoia at this point?
Well, I think that's the main question that's going to come up in the Council of the Suitors, right? But it happens just right after this scene. But one thing I do think is interesting is that you're talking about Telemachus truly being Odysseus' son in the chip off the old block, is when Odysseus has a bad part to his plan. Which is like, and we're gonna go and we're gonna check out all the field hands. We're gonna go out through all the farms. We're gonna check out each one of them. See if they ever whispered something that was not very loyal. And Telemachus is like, that's gonna take forever and get us nowhere. So let's not do that.
Yeah, it is interesting that you get the son kind of counseling and correcting his father, this kind of mastermind tactician. But also, I think here, not only do we see, like you said, that there's an imaging where Telemachus is being like Odysseus, but also I think we just, again, have to keep in his own coming of age story, because again, he answers his father, I think, with a respectful rhetoric, right? Of like, here's what I would think. And remember, this is the young man that when he first had to talk to Nestor is telling Athena in the guise of mentor, I don't even know what to say. I can't even talk to this man. So again, I think we've really seen in Telemachus, and we're seeing in these passages, a great maturity that's happened with him, in his own little Odyssey.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting here as well, is that the excess of Odysseus. I mean, Odysseus, who we talk about, are always trying to test people. There's a good to that, but Telemachus is rightly reining this in as well. Say, look, you say we are here to rid ourselves of the suitors. We do not need to test every single farmhand on the island before we do that.
It's interesting too that Telemachus appeals to his father's own standard, right? So he ends his little statement, that's work for later if you have really seen a sign from Zeus whose shield is storm and thunder. So he actually appeals to his father's own standard of like, listen, if the divine has really told you that we're coming up on the time to strike, we shouldn't be lollygagging around the whole island testing people. Like, we got to go into the palace and get this done.
Yeah, and I think this is, I mean, it really shows, like you said, that his maturation is coming through here, and being able to stand toe to toe with his father. Now, we're going to see, we just saw that's not completely true, in that he couldn't perceive Athena in the way that his father can, and yet he is growing to being able to engage with his father more on equal footing.
Agree. Well, let's kind of push into the narrative that tends to end book 16, which is now it follows the loyal swineherd running back to the palace to tell Penelope that, hey, your son has returned, right? Which then, of course, then the suitors hear this. And it says a little bit before line 380 that their spirits were dashed, right? That thumos is broken in them, that they hear Telemachus has returned. Because if we recall correctly, they had sent a ship out to ambush Telemachus on his way home, right? So Telemachus is going off and visiting these islands or these different places, Pylos and Sparta. And on the way back, he was going to get ambushed, and Telemachus is saved from that. And so it's interesting to see the responses, right? Because then we're also told that the ship that was going to ambush him has also returned. So they've realized that they've missed him in some capacity. And we got our boy, where is he here? Our boy Antinous, right? Or Antinous, however you want to pronounce his name, who just always seems to be kind of the troublemaker of the group. So he basically says, well, we just need to kill him. We need to plot his death. We need to kill him. We can't be blamed for it. So we need to wait until, he's down in a field or on a road somewhere and strike first and kill the prince.
I think, there's a question that every time you think the suitors are have reached a new low, they kind of try they continue to surpass you, but he also he lays out part of his reasoning. He's part of what he's concerned about. He says, is that the people are no longer completely on our side. He's afraid that as Telemachus is maturing, that he's going to stand up in the assembly. He's already done this once at the beginning, and people basically didn't listen. But he went out anyway, ultimately, and looked for his father. And he's like, look, I think he's turning people against us. And if we're going to, if they hear that we've been plotting his death, they're going to turn against us completely. So we may as well, we've got to follow through before they hear about it. And then it'll be a fait accompli, and, what can they do?
So it's interesting because we talk about, whether the suitors have any latitude in their own obedience, disobedience to guest friendship. Do they understand the violation? So here we do see somewhat of a muting of them, right? Because Antinous is like, let's kill him. And then Antinous, right, kind of mellows this, saying, no, I don't have any desire to kill Telemachus. Not I. It's a terrible thing to shed the blood of kings. Wait, sound out the will of the gods. That first. If there's a decrees of mighty Zeus, commend the work. I'll kill the prince myself and spur on all the rest. He becomes a really fascinating character, I think, in this, just insofar as, like, here he's appealing to the gods and whether the gods will do this, completely blind to the fact that the gods and Zeus have basically already ruled on this, but it's not Telemachus that's been fated to die.
Well, I think you have to combine these two things. Like the last thing that Antinous says is something to the effect of, well, if you don't want to kill him, then we should all each go to our own homes and woo her, as it were, the proper way, and send her gifts and try to win her, and let's just give up this wasting of Odysseus's household. So it's like either we go all in, or we go back to the way you to a certain acknowledge that how we all ought to be acting, and then how do we do Amphinomos and Amphinomus?
Amphinomus, sure.
I think he's an interesting character, as you're saying, because he seems to speak well. I mean, but he I think it's he doesn't want to kill Telemachus. He also doesn't strongly want not to kill Telemachus. He's willing. What he really wants to do more than anything is not, I think, so much find the will of the gods here as to kick the can down the road. So I think. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say one immediate problem with his plan is that if he represents the middle ground, right, is that his middle ground is unfortunately the plan that keeps them doing what they're doing. So this kind of goes back to the thing is like, he thinks he's kind of doing this prudential decision of like, hey, let's just wait and see what the gods have in store. But the irony is that by him waiting to keep carrying out the same thing they're doing in this violation of guest friendship, is that this is going to lead right to this terrible end for them.
I think that's really clear, because I there's somewhere I read that this it put it so well, because it said something to the effect that a lukewarm resistance to evil will not do. And I think that's what you've got here, is that he realizes there's something wrong about this, although even then it's at an attenuated level. I don't want to kill a nobleman. Well, I might kill somebody, or I might kill a nobleman too if the gods told me to. But let's just not do anything yet. And what is the effect of that is that Antinous has said, look, we either should go home and do this the right way, or we should go all in and kill him and take it for ourselves. And Antinous is like, well, we could just wait and keep doing what we're doing, which is, I'm contrast this with the psalmist, right? So who says, I made haste and prolonged not the time to keep thy commandments. This is the exact opposite. I'm going to wait a little bit longer. I'm going to keep doing the wrong thing a little bit longer, and then maybe later I'll do the right thing. And I think I take a somewhat harsher view, I guess, of Amphinomus here. Not in a way that I don't want to be. How do I think there's a lesson here, which is that you don't know how. It's sort of the lesson of we're coming up on Lent, of the first readings in Lent, to seek the Lord while he might be found. I don't think he realizes how close the judgment day is, and he's willing, or as Odysseus says, the fatal day, and he's willing to delay a little bit longer. And instead of even following, I'm not saying it's good advice, but instead of even following the advice to kill Telemachus or go home, so everyone there might have gone home right then. Amphinomus might have gone home right then, but what does he do instead? It says, and he got up and left for the house of Odysseus, and on arrival sat down on the polished chairs there. I mean, I think if you want the line at which their fates were sealed, that's it.
Yeah, that's the irony, right? Is that his kind of deferential nature to the gods is actually what dooms him, because the gods have already fated that he's going to die if they stay inside that house. Yeah, there's a part coming up that I think that I, in retrospect, have argued that that's when their fates are sealed. But I like this part as well. Let's push it forward a little bit with Penelope. So basically, if I understand this correctly and track the literal, is that the herald hears everything that the suitors have said, and the herald reports this. And this is important to mark this for the herald, because his own fate through this as something for us to watch. But he goes back and reports this to Penelope. Penelope, which I think is interesting, right, comes out and then actually chastises Antinous about, doing this and that he's going to actually kill her son. She actually comes out and really kind of waylays into him. And the character that catches my imagination here is Eurymachus, because then he comes in and he in a certain way is more dangerous than Antinous. So Antinous is I mean, he's an idiot. Everyone knows what Antinous is thinking because he's just going to tell everybody and etc. Eurymachus kind of represents the suitor that has the greatest capacity for rhetoric in my mind. And I think in a lot of ways, which I think is important to the narrative as we move forward, Antinous and Eurymachus represent the two leaders of the suitors. Right? That's kind of what they represent. They're the leaders here. And so Eurymachus then kind of mellows this out with his rhetoric, saying, who would lift a hand against Telemachus, your son, right? So to me, your son is the dearest man alive, right? He kind of lays this on thick. And Homer makes this incredibly explicit because that's around, his talk is around 490, a little bit before 500. Homer tells us, encouraging all the way, but all the while plotting the prince's murder in his mind.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it shows Odysseus is the sort of a master rhetorician, and we see mostly, it's a bit ambiguous here and there, mostly Odysseus using rhetoric for good. This is a clearer example of someone deliberately using rhetoric for evil. In a way there's not even fudging the lines about lying here. Well, maybe he misrepresented this a little bit, or this is just straight up. Everything he has said is untrue. There's not one aspect of it. Telemachus is by far the dearest of men to me. It's just, this is lie pushed to its furthest extreme. And I think there's also a cruelty in it, not only the cruelty of murder, but she has voiced a just complaint. How dare you men who have in fact been defended by my husband? Many of you, your own households were you came here as beggars, you came here needing help, and we helped you. And now you're plotting the death that, you're plotting against his house and the death of his son. How dare you, basically. And Eurymachus's response here is something to the effect of, oh, you're making a big deal out of nothing. Everything's going to be totally fine. Just calm down. Nothing's going to happen to Telemachus. So I think there's also kind of like this extra layer of cruelty in it, of someone who has a just complaint that is then turned into something to the effect of, you're making a big deal out of nothing. You're just hysterical. Now, I don't think he means that to be her own response, right? Because it says that he's trying to do this to cheer her and presumably to deceive her. But the effect is also one of cruelty in both ways.
And one thing I'd like to point out here too is, to what degree is Eurymachus believed? And it occurred to me, because I wrote a little note out here, because when I was reading this the first time, I actually had a positive view of Eurymachus. And then all of a sudden, Homer really just lays us on quite clearly and grants you clarity of what his mind is thinking, that there's this duality between his speech and his mind. And if you look back on book 15 at 581, Telemachus actually appeals to Eurymachus as someone that could be a good host for the prophet, right? Because he has this prophet that he's brought back with him. He's trying to figure out what to do with him. Just like with the beggar, his own home isn't suitable for guests because of the suitors. And so Telemachus actually mentions Eurymachus as being a good host. Maybe you could go stay with him. So it's not clear to me that Telemachus even quite understands the level of depravity of Eurymachus. And you also have to think that these are guys, I mean, some of them are his peers, which is kind of interesting, but a lot of them too, have made an impact on him as a young man. That, he's trying to judge these men's hearts a lot of times as an adolescent, right? Being 12, 13 years old, and what these men have told him. And so this is I actually found this to be somewhat of a heartbreaking scene where I'm not sure how much I want to lean into it, that Telemachus has like a friendship with him or whatever. But the level of betrayal here is palpable.
No, I think that's a brilliant insight. I mean, I didn't pick up on that at all until now that you're mentioning it. Yeah, I think Telemachus is completely taken in. I don't think Penelope's taken in. But I
don't
think
think so either.
Penelope has a greater level of insight than Telemachus does.
So the book ends with we go back. The scene shifts back to the swineherd's hut. We have Telemachus there. The swineherd returns, and we have Odysseus, who has been, regarbed, divinely speaking, as a beggar. And I don't know, what do you make of this? I mean, it ends with one is I agree with you. I kind of found it we were lingering here about why is a swineherd not being let in, because I kind of thought like, oh, when he returns, he'll find Odysseus, King Odysseus, in his hut. But that's not what happens. But it kind of ends, I think, in this very I don't know if it's like guest friendship, but it just ends in this piece of food and drink and bed and the gift of sleep.
Well, I also think it's interesting. So it says Athena, reclothed Odysseus in his beggar's rags and old age. It says, for fear that the swineherd might recognize him at sight and then go off and tell prudent Penelope and not keep the news to himself. I think there's at least a notion that. Now, we actually know that the swineherd is discreet because the herald went out and just shouted the return of Telemachus, and then it says that the swineherd went up beside Penelope and told her the rest of the story. So we actually are advised that he's somewhat discreet. But I think there's an idea that he's almost too honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he's just going to let the cat out of the bag, and he just can't help it because he's not a good liar. And this plan requires good liars. And I don't know what to make of that within like the Greek moral sphere here, because Odysseus, I mean, one of the qualities that Odysseus is praised for over and over again is that he's simply an excellent liar.
Right. Yeah, that's what Athena praises him for on the beach, right? That they both are the old hands of intrigue, and that Odysseus can tell these narratives at the drop of a hat. Yeah, it doesn't strike me that the swineherd would be very good at that at all.
No, not
So no,
at all.
I think that's a fascinating insight as to maybe why Odysseus, or really Athena, is delaying the swineherd knowing this is because of his own, I don't know what you want to call it there, because I don't know if it'd be arete for the Greeks themselves, but his own capacity to lie, or at least lie might be a strong term, right? To have this kind of mask that you have to put on via rhetoric is just not there for him.
He kind of reminds me of Samwise in, I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's just kind of, there's a certain innocence about him.
But that's
very
fitting,
good.
by the way, right? Because Tolkien did say that Samwise is really the true central hero of the Lord of the Rings, and there's a sort of fitting here that like the noblest heart he might really be the swineherd.
I like that theory. I would run with that. Well, anything else on book 16? Any major themes that we didn't touch on?
No, although I do like the line that it ends on the gift of sleep that you mentioned. I think there's something just sweet and innocent about the closing of this. Before all these major events are about to unfold, to have just food and rest and company and sleep.
And I think too, what's implied there is the rest and peace that Telemachus has, knowing that his father has returned, right? That there's a certain rest there for him that's probably different than any other rest he's actually had his whole life.
Well, there's a great little line here right at the end, and it says, or right before the end, he says, and so he spoke, and Telemachus, princely in power, smiled with a quick glance at his father, but avoiding the swineherd's eye. I mean, this knowledge, I think there's in that little smile, you can get this sudden notion that, look, everything's actually going to be all right. I mean, obviously, there's still there's trials to endure yet, but for the first time, I think maybe you get the idea, maybe things are going to be all right after all.
Yeah, and I would watch that because I think that as the text develops, I think Telemachus just keeping an eye on his father actually becomes a motif throughout the text, right? I think he anchors a lot of his actions moving forward on looking at his father and waiting for that nod, if you will, right? That kind of cascades down from Athena. So, no, very good. Well, Thomas, we appreciate you being on Ascend to the Great Books podcast today and helping us through book 16 of the Odyssey. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, well, next week we will take on Book 17 and see how Odysseus does infiltrating his own home as a beggar as we continue our year of Homer. So visit us on thegreatbookspodcast.com and check us out on X and YouTube. Thank you, everyone.